Good morning and welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. It is Monday, January 30th at 11 a.m. and we are here this morning for an allowable ex parte briefing from conservation voters of South Carolina. Before we begin, let's take a roll call of commissioners. With us virtually, we have Commissioner Irvin, and present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Carol Lee Williams, Commissioner Caston, and Chair Belser. Let's take appearances from the councils present today. Who's here with conservation voters of South Carolina?
Chair Belser, good morning. Commissioners, Court Walsh for...
Mr. Walsh, can you talk into that microphone? You really have to get close. I'm
Certainly.
sorry.
Is that better?
Yes, sir.
All right. Again, Court Walsh for conservation voters of South Carolina. I'm with the law firm of Nelson Mullins. Also with the conservation of voters of South Carolina, John Tynan, the executive director, is here with me, and Mr. Albert Lynn, who will be presenting the material this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. We'll circle back in just a second. And who's here as the neutral representing the Office of Regulatory Staff?
Madam Chair, Vice Chair Powers, members of the Commission, good morning. Nicole Given here on behalf of the Office of Regulatory Staff.
As with any allowable ex parte briefing, we have to do these in compliance with the South Carolina Code, so I'm going to recognize our staff counsel, Ms. Clausen, to give some instructions, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Commissioners, and to all who are present here today, in person or virtually. Today is Monday, January the 30th, 2023, and we are here in the Commission's hearing room pursuant to a notice of request for an allowable ex parte briefing from conservation voters of South Carolina in docket number ND-2022-72-E. This matter has been noticed on the Commission's website as required by South Carolina Code Annotated Section 58.3.260C6. The subject matter notice to be discussed today relates to the economics of natural gas and natural gas markets and lessons learned from other states. This, I would remind everyone, is a briefing and not a hearing. The briefing must be conducted in compliance with the provisions of South Carolina Code Section 58.3.260C, and the requirements of that statute are, in part, that the allowable ex parte briefing be confined to the subject matter which has been noticed. I would therefore ask the presenters, commissioners, and staff to please refrain from discussing any matters not related to the specific topics. The statute prohibits any presenter, commissioners, or commission staff from requesting or giving any commitment, predetermination, or prediction regarding any action by any commissioner as to an ultimate issue which either is or is likely to come before the commission. I would also ask the presenters, staff, and commissioners to refrain from referencing any report, article, statute, or document of any kind that are not included in today's presentation. A copy of any document which is referenced during the briefing must be provided to the Office of Regulatory Staff for inclusion into the record, which will be certified to the Chief Clerk of the Commission, Ms. Jocelyn Boyd. If anyone during the course of this briefing exceeds the scope or does not comply with or fails to conduct themselves within the provisions of South Carolina Code Section 58.3.260 governing allowable ex parte briefings, it is expected that a contemporaneous objection will be made. And finally, everyone in attendance, in person or virtually, must sign in or register. Everyone in the hearing room or watching virtually must read, sign, and return the form which you were given at the door, or the form which will be emailed to you for your virtual appearance, which will include instructions and the deadline for its return. It is required by law for each attendee, whether attending virtually or in person, to certify that the requirements contained in Section 58.3.260C have been complied with in this presentation. Thank you all for your time and attention. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Clausen. Before we proceed, I recognize Ms. Given as the neutral in this proceeding. Do you have any additional comments you wish to make as
Thank you,
far as
Madam.
processes, procedures?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the only thing I would note is that as the ORS designee, it's my duty to certify that the record of this proceeding to the chief clerk within 72 hours, whether or not the briefing was conducted in accordance with the statute 58.3.260C. And I don't believe any of the information contained in the presentation appears to have been marked or requested confidentiality. So I just ask that the presenters refrain from referencing or discussing any materials over which they would like to maintain confidentiality, and would ask that commissioners please be understanding if the presenters decline to provide such information to the commission. Questions here.
Thank you, Ms. Given.
Thank you.
Mr. Walsh, I'll recognize you and your team.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair Belzer. Commissioners, again, John Tynan. I'll allow him to take over from here and introduce Mr. Lynn, our presenter. Thanks.
Good morning. Great to see you all again, Chair Belzer, Commissioners. Again, I'm John Tynan. I'm Executive Director of Conservation Voters of South Carolina. We as an organization are one of the leading bipartisan voices fighting to protect the air, land, and water of our state. And what that means is we deal with a lot of issues, energy chief among them. And in doing our work, we spend a lot of times talking to both lawmakers, to talking to voters and constituents, ratepayers, and others, and hear a lot of questions. And as those questions come up, we want to make sure we have those discussions, have those dialogues, and share some of those with you all. This is our second allowable ex parte briefing. Thank you for doing the one. It was late last year. This one really stems from an increasing number of comments and questions from lawmakers and supporters of ours about rising energy costs. So we've brought Albert Lynn. He's the Executive Director of Pearl Street Financial. And he's going to be discussing the economics of natural gas, what factors contribute to those changes in gas prices, and then also what actions other states are doing related to these natural gas price fluctuations. Pearl Street, it's an organization that's really designed to analyze financial motivations and risks and consequences of energy policy. And so he brings a very unique perspective to this conversation. He's got history working in a regulated telecom utility doing financial planning. He was a financial analyst on Wall Street, and he worked for an institutional investment firm as well at one point. So robust background, and pleased to turn it over to Albert.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Commissioners, for spending time with me today. I'm sure it's not a surprise that many Americans are worried about rising costs on a lot of fronts. Today, we're going to talk about some of the drivers that affect natural gas and the price of natural gas and how it influences the electricity bills, but also talk a little bit about what other states are doing, because you're not alone. This is, I would say, a pretty national concern. Let me advance the slide here. We're going to do this by talking about 4 major trends and then 4 what I'll call lesser trends but significant developments. A major trend is something that has been in place for a long time, has tremendous inertia, has a lot of financial implications. The 4 we're going to talk about is how the electricity industry has become the top customer for the natural gas industry, the storage of natural gas and what is taking place with the infrastructure of being able to provide natural gas in this state and this country, and then overseas demand and what is the impact of international buyers of natural gas and what it means to the U.S. market, and then talk a little bit about the physical industry of natural gas and the high rates of depletion. All right. Major trend number 1 is that the electricity industry has become the top customer for natural gas. On your left is a chart. The different colors represent the uses of natural gas by major industry. You'll see that the light blue is electrical power. You'll note that it used to be pretty small way back in the day, and it has grown to be the largest. I have picked two data points on the right-hand side that show electricity power as a sector customer for natural gas has grown about 300% since 1973 to the latest data we have at 2021. Why is 1973 significant? We'll get more into that, but that's when the fuel adjustment clause became popular nationwide. That's when we had an oil embargo against the United States by a lot of countries that were exporting oil, and it caused the prices to rise dramatically. Now here's a chart showing the last 3 years of natural gas usage in the United States for electricity. I'll point out that all 3 years essentially set all-time high records, including the last 2 years that were recorded. So this is Department of Energy EIA data. They track this pretty closely. And being at an all-time high as a trend, I think, is something that we have to recognize, whether you're looking at things at a state level or looking at it nationally. Now, South Carolina is definitely part of this trend. This data simply takes the electricity sector's use of natural gas and compares it to everybody else. You'll notice for the last 20 years, everybody else is fairly flat or just slightly growing. But you'll also notice electricity, which was fairly insignificant 20 years ago, is now larger. So sometime in just the last few years, the electricity industry has grown to be the biggest customer for natural gas. So if you are a commercial or industrial business thinking about moving to a state, you have to ask yourself, can you compete with the largest user that happens to be a regulated utility for a critical input in your business? I think this is one of the reasons why, despite the growth of the economy, you don't see a lot growing in areas that are sensitive to the use of natural gas over the last few years. Now, along with that, we'll get to trend number 2. So we see natural gas usage is at an all-time high for electricity nationwide. We know that South Carolina is experiencing similar trends. But trend number 2, the problem is the storage and infrastructure to deliver that natural gas has not grown to meet demand. There's lots of reasons for it, but the chart you see before you, the gray area indicates the high and low for the last 5 years of storage. It hasn't changed much. And you will see that the natural gas industry right now recognizes that it's hard to be motivated financially to want to build a lot of storage. It's expensive and it's built to serve an industry that is highly volatile. So they really haven't gone about building a lot of infrastructure, but yet demand keeps going up. And as every state decides individually that they want more natural gas, they have to realize they're competing in a world where the supply and the infrastructure to deliver that natural gas has really not grown to match this growing demand. All right. Now, what does that really mean as far as the supply and the demand coming together? Well, first, this chart looks messy, but it's pretty straightforward. It's all the different technologies that are used to generate electricity that use a fuel of some kind. What you really need to take away from this chart is notice how every year there's a big spike and a little spike. That's your summer peak, that's the big one, and then the winter peak is usually the lesser one. What is important about this pattern is we know that in the electricity industry, this happens year in and year out and has been a long-term trend. But the natural gas industry happens to also have similar peaks. The natural gas industry calls it an injection season and a withdrawal season. Injection is when demand is low and you can fill your storage and inject natural gas to prepare for the peak times when it's the withdrawal period where you have to take it out of storage. The problem with the electricity industry becoming the biggest customer is you have now exaggerated those peaks. You've added the peaks of the electricity industry, a summer peak and a winter peak, to the existing peaks of the natural gas industry, which we just saw has pretty much the same amount of storage it's had for the last 5 years. And all that means is the number of times you'll run into a shortage and have scarcity of natural gas is increasing. And when you have a shortage of natural gas or an abundance, you find that natural gas is one of the most price-sensitive commodities out there. And this chart simply measures a 30-day average volatility, the difference between high and low, and that is trending to become larger and larger, which just reflects the fact that this number of occurrences of scarcity or overabundance is growing because you have this big imbalance between the demand for natural gas and your ability to store and supply it. We just set a record in February 2022. That's the all-time spike, and that happened to coincide with the Ukrainian war. But even before it, we were starting to set records in volatility. All right, so now let's look at trend number 3. Trend number 3 is the international market and how it affects the United States. You see this chart? The blue line is the price of natural gas in Europe. The red line is the price of natural gas in the United States. You will notice for a long period of time, Europe always has to pay more for its natural gas. This has created an interest in the natural gas industry to find a way to take our natural gas and ship it to Europe because you can get more money. Now, you'll notice as we go through time, the last year or so, the price gap between the US price and the European has become absolutely massive. So ask yourself, what would a rational natural gas producer want in an environment where they can sell the same physical natural gas, the same molecule of natural gas overseas for a multiple of what they can sell it for domestically? Well, you get a supplier that doesn't want to sell anything to a fellow American, but wants to make a lot more money and help a friend internationally. And that begets a whole new industry called LNG shipping. It's actually not that new an industry, but it became very large in just the last few years. The chart on the left is 2016, and you'll see this is measuring the United States natural gas exports, how much went by pipeline versus how much goes overseas. And you'll see in 2016, which wasn't that long ago, we didn't really ship much by ship. But that has been growing to where it overtook the industry of the pipeline portion to where now we ship more natural gas using a boat than we do a pipeline. And of course, if you're putting natural gas on a boat, it's because it's leaving the country for sure. It's going somewhere over the oceans. On the right-hand side is a chart showing where does the world, especially Europe, get its natural gas? Well, you'll see in the light blue that Russia, in the last few years, was a very big supplier. Well, what does Russia have to do with us in America, much less South Carolina, when it comes to natural gas? Well, the fact that the Russian pipeline no longer works, the fact that governments like ours and many of the Europeans have put sanctions on the Russians and are going to refuse to buy their natural gas means somebody has to replace Russia, who was a big supplier to Europe. That somebody happens to be people in the United States. They want to play that role. Well, how big is it in the United States? Well, the top map shows the United States and all the current existing LNG ports. This is how we ship natural gas to other countries. You'll see most of them happen to be on the Atlantic side, so Europe becomes kind of an easy go-to customer. On the bottom map, you're going to see all the approved LNG ports, and we split it up. The top couple are the ones that were not only approved, but are being built right now. Big money is being spent. The bottom list, which is extremely long, is the ones that are approved. So if they get financing and if they can get the European pricing in place, they're going to want to build those too. And I just want to mention that if you're a business commercial user and you're worried about competing with a big utility that needs the same input, natural gas, to run your business, think how crazy it is if you're a state and you're going to have to face this issue where the prices are higher internationally and you have to compete with a foreign government. Germany is the #4 largest economy in the world. They have just announced they're going to spend about 6% of their entire country's GDP. That's the same size as the first stimulus done during the pandemic. That would be the equivalent of $1 trillion plus in the United States, going to help their citizens afford the high price of natural gas. Obviously, we're here today talking and concerned about rising prices of natural gas, but imagine we all just showed that Europe even pays more. So whatever pain we're feeling, the average citizen in Europe is feeling more, and they're even more panicked. But their government is willing to step in and subsidize that, but that's going to simply create a chain reaction where our natural gas producers are going to want to even sell more, because the government over there is not going to default. They're like the safest customer you can sell to, and that's going to make our markets have even a greater supply issue. Now, the fourth major trend is just the fact of how natural gas gets produced. Natural gas experienced a tremendous technology boom called fracking, and that allowed the United States to become a major producer of natural gas from areas that people didn't ever think they could recover natural gas from. The problem with that technology today is the well that you start and produce this year loses about 25% of its productive capability the following year. And then the third year, it loses another 25%. In the industry, they call that the depletion rate. Oil wells do it too. Lots of commodity producers have to overcome this depletion curve, but they're not as steep as natural gas. If natural gas does not invest in enough wells today, they will lose 25% of the existing production. So just to keep production flat, they have to invest a tremendous amount in ongoing wells. Otherwise, the supply starts to diminish very quickly. All right, so those are the major four trends I wanted to make everyone aware of. They're easy to research. You will be able to have you or your staff look at lots of information from lots of companies. It's a big industry. People are following this. Now, here's some other notable developments. A notable development in my mind is something that significantly does impact supply or price, but it can be reversed. It's not one of the four trends we just talked about that's very well ingrained with a long, long history. We'll cover these very quickly. The first one is that suppliers are consolidating. Now, we all like choice. Americans know you get the best price and the best quality when you have some choice and competition. The problem in the natural gas industry is it is consolidating rapidly. The green bars show the cumulative number of bankruptcies of oil and gas producers. The yellow is the number of new ones that entered that year. This industry has largely set the record for bankruptcies, which is really, really odd, because if you look at the time frame, this is during the greatest bull market in all human history. It is also during a time when interest rates fell to levels we haven't seen since the World Wars. Interest rates essentially went to zero. So in the greatest bull market with great economic growth, with interest rates going to zero, this industry found a way to bankrupt more companies than anyone else. And I think that is scary, because you are trying to balance the reliability and the necessity of electricity as a basic need for everyone in your state, but it is being tied to an industry that for its entire existence has been highly volatile and just went through a massive half-decade event of massive bankruptcies, which you can imagine, if you are a saver or a lender, the last industry you're going to want to lend to is the one you view as most risky. And this has become a problem. Right now, Wall Street, which is development number 2, is hesitant to lend to the upstream producers of natural gas and oil because they're worried the industries are risky and extremely volatile. Another thing to note is that the US dollar is incredibly strong. Now, normally we don't pay attention to the dollar, because if you live in America, you just use your dollars, you earn your dollars, you don't think too much about it. You might worry about inflation and things like that, but usually you don't worry about what does that dollar mean internationally. Well, I'll tell you, the rest of the world worries. At the end of this year, 88% of foreign exchange transactions, meaning international trade, was done in US dollars. I mean, the world needs dollars. The problem is the world's economies are weaker. Most of them have interest rates that are lower. And these charts just simply show you where foreign currencies trade against the dollar. And you're going to see every line is trending down. And they're trending down significantly. Well, what does that mean? That means the foreign users of currency have to pay more to get a global commodity like oil or oil byproducts or things like that that are always denominated in dollars. What it means at home is our strong dollar has actually helped us keep prices low. If you think people were complaining, prices would have been higher and worse if not for the fact that the greenback was so strong. The last development that I think is of interest that you should consider is natural gas has a characteristic called associated natural gas. Associated natural gas is just a term that says, I'm an oil producer, I want to get oil, but mixed with that oil is natural gas. I don't really want the natural gas. It's not my prime business. I don't know what to do with it, so I dump it on the market. Now, normally, people would say, oh, great, then we get cheap natural gas because the oil industry views it as a waste product and they throw it away. But what we're finding is it's not really helping the natural gas market. It just adds an element of volatility and unpredictability to it because oil producers produce oil when the price of oil is high. But the price of oil almost has nothing to do with the price of gas. If you were to look at those charts, they don't move together at all. There's different factors that affect those industries. So I think here we want to pay attention. These charts just show you the volume that between 8% to 16% of the natural gas market is this associated natural gas. It's coming up with our gigantic and growing oil production business. Nothing wrong with a vibrant industry, but if this vibrant industry is linked to your natural gas industry and has factors that drive its price and popularity that have nothing to do with the needs and pricing of natural gas, you're just creating greater volatility and a level that is less predictable. Okay, we don't have to cover all these key considerations in this slide because that's what you do every day. I think the real challenge is what factors do you need to study and be aware of so that you can create the best balance of making sure policies match real world dynamics. Oftentimes there's a lot of risk in the real world and you either have to solve it or you have to shift it to some party that can handle it. The fuel adjustment clause. This is becoming a popular topic. Well, why is it a popular topic? It's been around forever. Well, if you study the history of it, it gets back to that opening slide where we talked about 1973. In 1973, the fuel adjustment clause turned the cost of any fuel used for generating electricity to be basically 100% responsibility of the customer as opposed to 100% responsibility of the utility. Now, why do we care about who has financial responsibility? I think the areas and factors that must be considered is, the first one is moral hazard. If you're in the world of finance, you know, or if you're in insurance or any of these industries, you know that if there's a party that has no financial ramifications for any decisions it makes, it tends not to focus on that decision because no matter what happens, it's no big deal financially. This moral hazard, I think, is becoming a growing issue that everyone should be aware of because if a policy has been around since 1973, the tendency is that's just endemic and part of the system. Like, why would you ever look at it to change? Well, these are the kinds of things that now have to be looked at because the world is changing and a lot has changed in 50 years. Financial policy should also be balanced with what is the most efficient outcome, what is most economic, and not just how do I shift a real world risk to another party just because I think that party can afford it. Now, what are other states doing? Certainly, South Carolina is not the only one facing a lot of these national trends. It's a national trend because a lot of states are feeling the same pressures. Idaho and Hawaii have decided 100% fuel cost pass-through is a bad policy. They are starting with modest sharing. They ask the utilities, either through the IRP process, to give a forecast, or they give an annual forecast, but they come up with a mechanism to say the utilities must have some interest in trying to optimize the outcome. And so the way they decided to do it is there must be some cost sharing of that fuel, because the fuel is the largest operating cost of most fossil plants. It's certainly true of natural gas, and it's true of coal plants. There's also an expansion of fuel cost review. Most states do have a fuel docket, but the fuel docket runs very quick, and it's largely an approval process of were the expenses proper. No one really debates over, is the cost too high? Were there other options and mechanisms? So states like Minnesota, Missouri, Montana, and the others in the list have begun to expand their fuel dockets to say it's not a quote, rubber stamp like process anymore. We are now going to start to look at and ask for more information on, did we do it optimally? Was this the best we could have done for the customers? This map simply shows by color which states have the highest average electricity bills and usage. You'll see the South and the Southeast have the highest. What does that mean? That means whatever you do here has greater impact for the nation. You're just more important. You have greater impact. You use more of these fuels. You have higher electricity usage. You're just in an area where if you take any kinds of improvements or actions, people will take notice and it'll help the country more. So I thank you very much for hearing me out on some of the major trends and what other states are doing. I am happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Lynn. Commissioners, questions for Mr. Lynn?
Madam Chair.
Vice Chair Powers?
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you today for your presentation. And you mentioned early on, Mr. Lynn, about infrastructure. And it seems to be some problem as far as notable development. Is there any progress that you would know about lawsuits which are holding up pipelines and causing South Carolina in particular to have such a problem getting supplies?
Well, I will say I'm not familiar with any particular lawsuits, but I think the transmission of natural gas is a real world challenge, not just in South Carolina. I think the economics behind it are, do you want a large, cost-effective, but concentrated delivery system, or do you want a more expensive, more resilient, distributed system? And I think that's where a lot of the, I guess, fighting and debate tends to occur. So I think in the assessment of it, those are the things that hang in the balance, that trade-off. It's a little bit of long-term versus short-term resilience versus economic efficiency.
Okay. Well, you know, the big picture for us is South Carolina. That's what we have to deal with. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Commissioners, Commissioner Carol Lee Williams?
Thank you. And again, thank you for being here. We appreciate it. Mr. Lynn, I kind of go through from your presentation so that I don't ask you anything that wasn't brought up. So I'm flipping pages to get to the point where.
Well, feel free to ask anything. So.
Well, I can't. Someone will stop it. And of course, my notes are. Oh, I know. Okay, so this one occurred on page 6, where you're talking about the increase in natural gas as a share of what we use for electricity. Would you talk a little bit about, or more about, kind of why that has happened? For example, from my naive background, is it more combined cycle plants? Is it, what's the use function that has changed that?
Well, I would say there's a couple factors that drive that popularity. One is there's been a general trend away from coal generation. So the industry has been looking for what are alternatives. Natural gas was an attractive one and for a number of factors. So I think that became one of the drivers. The other is I talked a little bit about the shale gas revolution. There was a big technology breakthrough, largely invented in America, on how to produce natural gas from tight rock formations that people used to know there was natural gas but didn't know how to get it. Well, the technology arrived, and that lowered the price of natural gas tremendously and increased its volume of production. And that was a second driver of why I think it became very popular to do that. But outside of those two, there are probably other factors. I mean, the utilities themselves are trying to be as reliable as possible. And part of that is adopting technologies and business models that are familiar. And a natural gas plant to operate, staff, and to train people is more akin to what they were used to, coal, nuclear plants, than adopting other technologies. Now, I think over time, as people get more familiar and develop other experiences, that may change. But at that time, that's what drove the popularity. And there's also no doubt that the efficiency of natural gas turbines, if you think about what they are like a gigantic jet aircraft engine that's just stuck on the ground. But the efficiency of that technology also improved as global aviation and other things drove that technology efficiency. That also made it attractive.
Having mentioned fracking a couple of times, what is the projection there in terms of resource?
Well, as the industry grows and is now at record size, like any other common sense observation, it gets harder. As the industry gets bigger, it is getting harder to find the next great, quote, shale play. You have to go further. You have to go deeper. You get into more, I would call, gray areas where people worry about what may happen to water, what may happen to other parts of the geology. But that is the reality. If your industry is large and you have to replace the depletion, and if you want to grow to meet demand, you have to do greater than 25% increase every year, well, you're going to have to find a lot more new fields to exploit to meet that demand.
I think that was a really great general question. Do you have any specifics to add to it? I mean, a really great general answer, but do you have are there specific projections out there for, how many more years that new sources of shale are going to make a difference?
I think it's not a question of if the volume and the natural gas is there. Most estimates believe that there's well over 50 to 100 years, even at our current consumption. It's going to be a matter of cost. It's one thing to produce it. Costs are probably generally going up a little bit. But the bigger issue is what Commissioner Powers mentioned. You have to move it. Natural gas has to be put under at least slight pressure to put in a pipeline. It has to be put under enormous pressure to put it on a ship. So that's, I think, going to be one of the economic gating factors that will curtail what people may think the outlook or the life cycle would be for natural gas.
Thank you. I think I have one or two more questions. I may be asking you to reiterate this, but on page 9, and certainly I know from this job how volatile prices are, and is it really just and I realize the world economics that make it volatile at certain times, but clearly I think my question is, why so volatile? There are a lot of factors. Is there an answer to that question?
Well, I think the simple answer is natural gas, like oil, is a sort of miracle product. If you really think about what natural gas does, yes, you can burn it for heat, and that could be for cooking, heating homes, and running electricity plants. But natural gas is also a huge important component for building fertilizers. I mean, the world would be in a terrible situation if we did not have the technologies that could make fertilizers out of natural gas. Natural gas is also used in all sorts of other products in the healthcare and food industry. So the bottom line is, when you have a volatile supply and it's meeting a critical use industry, it becomes highly price sensitive to the scarcity factor. So anytime people feel natural gas is going to run low, you can imagine they start to panic. I mean, if you're in the healthcare industry or if you're in one of these other critical industries, you're going to start paying up a high price because it is absolutely critical for you to get that natural gas. And now that electricity has become the biggest sector, I can assure you there are many industries that are very afraid because they view that it is impossible to compete with a regulated utility as your biggest competitor for the same input economically you need to create your business. It's just a hard world. But the reason why the price is so volatile is because you cannot store it easily. It's very expensive to store. You cannot transport it that easily. It's not impossible, but you all know, you look at choke points and where markets can and cannot be served and the difficulty of right-of-ways for pipelines and all sorts of other factors that make it what it is. And that's why the price is so extreme. Even Texas, the state that is known for energy, oil and natural gas, they had to put price caps on electricity because during the summer, the natural gas peaking, the actual market price as a deregulated market would have gone so high it would have absolutely bankrupted companies. They would have to just shut down during the summer and avoid using electricity or natural gas. That's how valuable it is, and that's how sort of tight and volatile the market is, and the price reflects it.
Thank you. Still looking for my questions as I go through. I'm asking it looking at page 11. I don't know that you need to go there, but maybe the question is increasing pipeline versus shipping alternatives. Can you add anything to what is better, cheaper, more resilient?
In general, pipelines are always preferred to putting it on a ship. So essentially, when the industry looks to build a pipeline, it still takes time. The Nord Stream pipeline, which ran under the Baltic Sea from Russia all the way to Germany, took 10 years to build. But it was deemed more economic to build that pipeline than to try to sail ships. There's an effort in the Middle East to build and extend large pipelines to go all the way across the Mediterranean to serve Europe, to also replace Russia and therefore compete with the U.S. Suppliers. The challenge now is the ships. The ships are at least fairly fast to obtain and to build. The hard part is the terminals, but you can see the U.S. has been busy working away at terminals. Middle East does not have the same permitting issues and time, so they're probably going to build terminals faster. The challenge is nobody wants an export terminal in their backyard because these natural gas terminals that turn the natural gas into a shippable product have to freeze the natural gas and put it under extreme pressure. And the fear is if you ever have an accident, it will be absolutely catastrophic. And that's why it takes so long to permit them. That's why they're located in odd places. And then, of course, the more remote you make it, the harder it is to get workers. You can imagine there's a lot of things that make it challenging. But the money is big enough. The price differential is great enough. Because Europe today has all-time high prices, but think Japan, South Korea, there are other nations that don't have access to natural gas, and they bring it in by ship. And I think it's the intention of the U.S. natural gas industry to be able to serve as many of those customers as possible. The risk is they will do it at the expense of selling it domestically.
Thank you.
Oh, John was just saying on slide 10, there are some numbers in the chart. I just took some current prices. You add about $6 per million BTU to ship it to Europe. That's about the going cost. And normally you'd say, well, what's gas today? Well, gas is $3 to $4 a million BTU. To add 6, you would think, wow, that was so expensive. So that foreign market that wants to pay for shipping, they have to have a high enough price to almost at some point add 50% to doubling the U.S. price to make it worth it. But right now we have that dynamic, and we've had that dynamic in our past as well. So the economics create that incentive and have sustained it.
Thank you. There was some discussion about bankruptcy and the level of bankruptcy within natural gas companies. Have there been bankruptcies in the Southeast?
Well, this is mostly with upstream producers. So the Southeast doesn't produce as much, but in the Marcellus, in the Utica, in the Permian, in the Eagle Ford, those are in Texas, there have been a tremendous number of bankruptcies. The North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana area where the Bakken is the name of that field and play. There have been a tremendous amount of bankruptcies. And part of it is because they all showed up at the same time with this incredible technology that didn't increase the volume by a little bit, increased the volume by a lot. And what they did not anticipate is what would happen to price volatility. And when the prices went low, many of them could not afford the debt and service their loans and to continue operations.
That makes a lot of sense, and I really do appreciate the way in which you've answered my questions. I appreciate the education. I do have one further question, and it's for Mr. Tynan, because you talked at the very beginning about legislators asking you questions about what do we do about the increasing cost of natural gas. Are there any, is there a trend is there discussion about a solution? And what might those options be?
So I think these questions are relatively new. I mean, as we've seen, natural gas prices rise, and then those filter down to the various users. These questions of how do we address the impact on ratepayers, on customers, are beginning to come up because ratepayers are voters. And I think that's part of why, we asked Albert to come with, so that we can begin to look what are other states who have been facing this volatility, who are seeing impacts on ratepayers. Hawaii is a great example. When we look at South Carolina, we may have some of the highest electric bills in the country. Hawaii is usually up there with us on those lists. And so when we look at what other states are doing, what other solutions might be out there, we're hoping to start those conversations. And so that's one of the reasons Albert's here talking with you. We are talking to a number of lawmakers and stakeholders and others over the next few days while he's here. And so as for, is something pinned out and on paper at this point? No. Right.
Thank you. Again, I appreciate all of you being here. No further questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Justin Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, gentlemen. How's it going for you today?
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks for coming to spend some time with us. Mr. Lynn, is it possible to put slide 22 up on that large screen to my left? Are you all right? All right. Thank you, sir. So when I look at this, I am trying to figure out what to do with the information presented. So is this slide saying that and I'm focusing on South Carolina, is this slide saying our usage is high or the bill is high?
Well, actually, it says both.
Okay.
So it is measuring both. Like you'll notice, like California is infamous for having pretty much one of the highest prices per kilowatt, but they're lucky that on average they don't need to use as much electricity because the weather in general is better, and so their total bill is not as high. So they don't end up being one of the states that would have as much impact.
Okay. So when you're measuring, or okay. So this is what I'm trying to figure out with this slide. In my opinion now, you correct me if I'm wrong, there's a difference between a high bill caused by usage versus the cost of the widget, in this case electricity, is inherently expensive, right?
Absolutely.
So per kilowatt hour or per kilowatt, how does South Carolina, if you know, relate to California, since you just used that as an example?
Well, South Carolina is lower on a per kilowatt basis.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. What
So-
customers pay for sure is lower.
Is lower. Here's why that's interesting to me. We hear, you know, I'm sure you know, we hear all types of cases here. And in my experience, it seems that in South Carolina, we have ratepayers that use a lot of electricity for some reason or another. They use a lot. Now here, I think the argument is because of the weather. It's hot, it gets cold, and I can understand that. But then when I look down at Florida, it's much warmer in Florida. It seems like the usage in Florida is not as much as South Carolina. Now, do you think that's weather related, or?
I don't know if it's totally weather related, because this just, I think that the number between 1 through 10 in Florida is probably 11 or 12. That's why it's a different color. But I think if you were to look at the actual data and the sources listed below, you'll find that they're probably not as different as the color might imply, just because they're in a different zone. Like the top 15 or 20 are probably closer together than would be implied by just the fact that they are different colors on this map. This map just simply gave a different color to each group of 10.
I got you.
And Commissioner, I can add a bit to that. I think when you're looking at what drives usage, I think there's a wide range of factors. Certainly weather is one, right? So we do get a little colder than Florida does. I think you also look at age of housing stock, type of housing stock, how much manufactured homes do we have versus, single family homes, apartment buildings, et cetera. Appliances and those sorts of things. And all these things, those are kind of on the how efficient are we with the electricity and the natural gas that we use to heat our homes, to heat water, et cetera. And then you pair that usage with the efficiency, and that's when you end up, or inefficiency, and that's when you end up with these relatively high bills. So when you have upward pressure on natural gas costs, which may be driving up the per kilowatts as well as the cost per BTUs, paired with an inefficient housing stock, housing age, et cetera, that's what kind of leads us to be in the top piece. I think this. I believe that we have a relatively high percentage of inefficient manufactured homes in South Carolina as one of the driving factors for us as well.
Okay. And I can respect that. My parents' first home was a trailer. I grew up, I think, we moved when I was about 8 or 9, maybe about 10. So I get that. The reason I think that's important, and I would love to hear your opinion on it, Mr. Lynn. I want to call you Dr. Lynn for some reason, but whatever. I don't know why. Maybe it's just the way you command the information. As a decision maker, I want to make sure I know all the factors or components of that decision, whatever that decision may be. So when I hear high energy bills, high usage, high costs, in my mind, for whatever reason, I don't necessarily think about the inefficiency that has been brought up. And I'm just wondering, is there anything out there that can be done on the inefficiency piece? Because there's an argument to be made, if we have some of the lowest kilowatt per kilowatt pricing, then, while we always want to keep prices low and maybe go lower if we can, it seems like we may be throwing good money at bad money if we're not addressing the inefficiency piece. Does that make sense?
That does. That does. I think this slide has more to do with which states have impact for the nation than it does maybe particularly talk about efficiencies or anything on a per state basis. I mean, South Carolina is unique. You have a good base of nuclear. As far as Southeast states, 30% generation by natural gas is actually nowhere near the high. You have many neighbors that use a lot more natural gas. I think the challenge here is you have to weigh that balance of you are competing with those neighbors for that natural gas. And you are subject to these trends that may have 30% of your generation exposed to a lot of volatility. I think as sort of policymakers, you will have a lot of things to consider aside from what I just told you today. You will be looking at programs of demand response, conservation, and just energy efficiency and all sorts of things that I haven't even talked about, but you will have to bring into your analysis to decide, how do I create an optimal system? And I am only here to point out that natural gas was a good thing for a long time, but we have almost made a concentrated bet as a nation and in many, many states that are exposing it to a severe amount of volatility in price. That if everyone continued on this path, I doubt it would get better, meaning the volatility will remain high and maybe even set further records. And so that's my goal of trying to present you with information to integrate into all the other information you're going to hear and going to have to look at.
Understood. All right. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
And Commissioner, I will say, as we're looking at, this is our second one, allowable ex parte. I do think we hope to be able to continue to come and do additional ones. And I do know that on our list was one specifically focusing on the energy burden that South Carolinians are facing, energy efficiency opportunities. And so that may be a good, robust discussion for a whole additional allowable ex parte in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Commissioner Caston?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Lind, I guess I don't know if I'm expanding on question Commissioner Williams had, Justin Williams, but I want to make sure I'm expanding my understanding of it. When we were talking about that map on 22, the different colors and such, that, okay, because of, it's hot and humid here in the South, so during the summer, we're probably going to use more air conditioning than they are in Oregon. California, water's cold over there. And during the winter, while it's not Ann Arbor, it gets rather nippy. So we use electricity then. So what I think I'm understanding, you say the total bill may be higher, but the per kilowatt, dollar per kilowatt or whatever is less. So if that same energy consumption in South Carolina, the average energy consumption was in California or the other 49 states, that would be totally different, paint a totally
That is
different.
correct, yes.
And don't answer this question, but talking about the volatility and everything else, it almost sounded like you were making an argument for coal without saying coal, but I don't think that's what you're doing. Okay, thank you. I think I understand that. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Commissioner Caston. Commissioners, any further questions?
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Urban?
Thank you. Mr. Lynn, it's good to have you with us today, Conservation Voters of South Carolina.
Commissioner Urban, it's very difficult to hear you. Can you turn up your volume a little bit?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
That's a little better. Thank you.
Mr. Lynn, I'd like to ask you, in a state like South Carolina, where we have a disproportionate number of ratepayers living below the poverty level, the kilowatt rate would still have more of it really comes down to affordability, does it not, in terms of their annual income and the amount that they're paying for electricity?
Thank you for the question. Without doubt, affordability is impacted by operating cost. If you have something that has a high ongoing operating cost, it is more punitive to low income segments of your community, which then either your answer must be to come up with programs to address that directly, or to change that mix so that the operating cost is not so high. So generally, from an economic standpoint, the debate would come along the lines of how volatile and how expensive could the operating costs become over time versus investing in other programs, whether it's conservation, demand response, technologies that don't have a fuel component. You know, how do you balance all of those available options so that you create the social outcome that creates the stability that you want in your state so that everyone is served?
Thank you for that answer. And I guess that's why I believe it's Connecticut that actually has a separate rate for those that live under the poverty level. They have a reduced rate. You know, that might be one solution for other states to consider. How do you think that might play out?
That is one option. Other popular options that are being considered is you invest in, let's say, things that might have a higher upfront cost but are completely socialized. So if you invest in a renewable, let's say that has very low operating costs, then that makes it more affordable to the community, but you have to pay for it up front. And so that's the trade-off. But many people feel that it creates greater stability, at least financially, because low-income households do not face that ongoing operating cost burden. If you have volatile and high operating costs going forward, that's what creates the shock and the dismay to low-income communities when they get that bill, and then they have to turn to commissions and others to see if they can get relief.
One of the frustrating things I think that I've seen as a commissioner is when a company comes in for a fuel case, the news media reports it as a rate case increase. And so I think there's some confusion about what exactly the law requires us to do. And as you said earlier, we have to approve the bills that were incurred for whatever kind of fuel the regulated utility has purchased. And it's a 100% pass through, and we really have no way to address it under our current law. And what solutions do you mentioned what Hawaii did, but are there other solutions that we may be overlooking?
Well, many commissions have started to look at this issue and say, if you have a statute that may be much harder to change to address this and expand the scope and capability of the commission, many have turned to sort of incentive-based rate making, where they can singularly pull out a large and important item and say, let us by order settle this with the utility. So examples are, you create something that is symmetrical in benefit and economic pain for the utility, saying if you manage it well and you improve, you're not subject to over-earning, you make more money. But if you do poorly and make bad decisions or are unlucky and did not balance your portfolio, then it's going to start costing your shareholders something. And you sort of design these directed, there's 16 states that are essentially using this kind of a PIM or PBR, performance-based rate making, or performance incentive measure. That's what those acronyms stand for. But they're using these as tools while they work on the greater issue of, do we have to change the statute? But it gets to, I think, Tom, you are hinting at issues of moral hazard. And I think the goal of all commissions should be to make sure that they balance the incentives of all the major stakeholders so that you do not have a situation of moral hazard.
Well, I do believe that's the case, and I know when we go out for public hearings on rate cases, we see and hear shocking ratepayer stories about how they have to take cold showers and how they have to cut the heat way down in the winter and cut the thermostat way up in the summer. And if for a certain portion of our citizens here living in South Carolina, it's really becoming an affordability issue. They don't know whether to use their Social Security check to refill medications that may be needed, pay their utility bills. Being faced with some very difficult decisions, and you can't help but be concerned about how much longer can they sustain the kind of volatility that you talked about, because last year we saw natural gas prices increase by 100% year over year. It had a tremendous impact on ratepayers, and so I'm looking for solutions. One thing that I would like to see all investor-owned utilities do is have a hedging program, which some do and some don't. What are your thoughts about that? Would that give them some kind of like an insurance policy if prices spike, if they've already contracted to buy it at a lower price? Would that be a possible solution?
There are commissions who are looking at that as tools, but keep in mind, Wall Street supplies all those tools today. But the counterparty, meaning the utilities, do not need to avail themselves of any of those services, simply because if your fuel cost is being passed through at 100%, then it's more efficient to not have a big staff to interface with Wall Street traders, to get into contracts, to lock in prices. That's just considered relatively unnecessary. And remember, they're not offering this, quote, insurance for free. Wall Street is trying to price what they think that summer peak will be. They know it's coming. So you will have to pay more. So I think utilities, to their defense and perspective, they're going to look at this and say there's no upside. If the price of natural gas happens to be lower than the premium I paid for, everyone's going to look at me and say, who was behind that analysis that cost our customers more money than it would have been if you just did it like normal, took the spot price, delivered the service? So until those incentives change, I think it's very hard and very complicated to try to direct that kind of an outcome. I think you have to let the utilities do what they do best. You have to let Wall Street and the markets function, and you just have to create the incentives to say, please, look at all the options, let's eliminate moral hazard, and you pick the right mix of technologies and financial tools to optimize the outcome. And if you do a bad job at it, you and your shareholders will suffer along with the customers. If you do a great job, we will all benefit together.
Well, it does make sense, and I understand that there is a cost to hedging, but it's just one of many possible solutions that I've thought about. The other one was, to have a regional network transmission, so that maybe the southeastern part of this country could bring in additional power from Texas. It's not being used for winter peaking, and I guess I'm talking about an RTO. Is that what that means?
Well, you are bringing up all the complex options that the industry has to deal with, and look at the trade-offs. So increasing supply will help balance and lower volatility. But as I'm sure you all know, that increase in supply will not be free. It's who is going to pay for it, and how long will it take, and is it worthy of a long-term investment? These are not easy questions, but that's the kind of analysis that you and the industry participants will have to undergo.
Well, of all the solutions you've talked about so far, I think the one that makes the most sense is for the investor-owned utilities to have some skin in the game, so that they get penalized if they don't take reasonable and prudent steps to control costs, or alternatively, they get rewarded and incentivized if they do pay make it, such that the ratepayers would benefit from a more careful kind of, purchasing.
Yes,
These
you use the
fuels.
term skin in the game, and that's exactly the term the Hawaii Commission used when they created their fuel sharing program.
Well, it's interesting. I used that phrase in the dissenting opinion on this in one of our most recent fuel cases, because unless they do have skin in the game, they're not going to change their model in business, and they will if they're incentivized. If there's a way for them to make money for their shareholders, they'll make changes. Do you agree with that?
Yes, very much so.
We appreciate you all being with us today, and thank you for sharing these ideas and possible solutions with us. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Commissioner Urban. Commissioners?
Madam Chair, Mr. Lynn, I like the discussion about solutions, and I understand that this is a complex and can be a complicated matter. But then sometimes it strikes me as it's really not that complicated, in that we know what we know. Natural gas is highly volatile, and it's probably going to be like that in the short term, if not the long term. Isn't that fair?
I think that's accurate, yes.
And so if we use it as a generational source, bill is going to be higher, right? That's pretty simple. But what about other sources of generation? Wouldn't it be, you could argue, maybe prudent or just common sense to look at other sources of generation as opposed to natural gas?
If you're trying to avoid the growing risk of price volatility of natural gas, then absolutely looking at alternatives that are either low fuel or no fuel options are great. I mean, certainly everyone knows from just the popular media that inflation is a common topic that wasn't really talked about for 20 years, but all of a sudden here we are always talking about inflation. Certain technologies are not subject to much operating inflation. Solar and wind are obvious examples to where the cost of sunlight and the price of wind isn't. The challenge there is managing the dispatchability and the reliability. But everything can be solved with a cost. We know that you could put a lot of storage, but storage has a cost. I think the math just needs to be done. You have to think about what is likely the volatility and the price increase that you might experience with further building of natural gas versus building a low or no fuel alternative. And everyone knows that at some point, if you have a low or no operating cost model, there's a break even. It's just time. Does the community have the time and the patience to pay the upfront to then get the long-term benefit? And I think everyone has different sensitivities to it. I think people are surprised in the state of Texas, which is known for oil and gas, that they're actually the biggest renewable state. Everyone thinks it's California, but it's not. And I always sum it up to, you know why? It's because Texans like free. They know over time that wind, and they have tremendous wind resources. The Southeast has some wind resources. They have solar resources in Texas, but so does the Southeast. That over time, that's what's going to allow them to create that balance, even though their economy is highly, highly tied to the fortunes of oil and gas.
Right. So you see how easy you just offered those solutions to us? I don't really think it may be complicated with the math and the figures and all that, but someone somewhere has solved all these problems. We just haven't figured it out yet.
Well, I appreciate your willingness to look at elegant, simple, common sense solutions.
I'm from Wagner. I have no other choice. Mr. Lynn, you may not know where that is. Aiken County. A lot of, and if it don't make common sense, it don't make sense. I mean, that's the way I grew up. Any other technologies?
I think demand response and conservation have been heavily overlooked, in part because the utilities and a lot of other stakeholders just aren't really motivated to look deeply into implementing those kind of solutions. But remember, natural gas's major price spikes are coming during times of scarcity. And as measured in hours of the year, it's probably about 2% or less of the hours. It might be on 30 to 40 occasions over the year, but it's only about 2%. In Texas, by the way, the long-term average is 0.6% of the hours are the ones you're really worried about. And if you had a tremendous demand response program, say that's when prices get out of control, that's worth it a lot to conserve. We will pay you or pay another party or integrate the FERC Order 2222 for distributed energy resources and other things that I think you are probably looking at. You can actually shave those peak spikes downward tremendously, and that has a massive input. I mean, think there are natural gas plants that are designed to be summer and winter peakers only. They only run a few % of the hours of the year and make as much money as a base load, because they're coming at that critical, ultra expensive, valuable time. But as a commission, to think of all the tools available to you and say, how can I shave that peak down? What policies can I come up with? The economic impact would be tremendous.
And what I would offer to you and your team is, and I don't say this lightly, we don't know what we don't know. And so briefings like this and offerings that you've made and that you've made help us out tremendously. At times, it seems that our decisions come from a place where we almost feel boxed in when it comes to information. So the more we know, the better decisions we can make. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Lynn, Mr. Tynan, Mr. Walsh, anything else from y'all? I echo Commissioner Williams' sentiments on thanking y'all for being here today. This has been very informative, and we appreciate you coming in and sharing some of your knowledge with us, Mr. Lynn. Ms. Given, anything from you?
No, Madam Chair, thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. With that, again, we do appreciate your appearance. Thank you, and we will close this proceeding, and we are adjourned. Thank you.